It was in March of 2025 that the US ended up hitting Canada with tariffs. And we responded like this was the end of the world. How dare they, we scream. So we retaliate, break up with them, boycott Florida. Classic Canadian move, all feelings but no real leverage. However, Canada was not alone in being hit like this. Another country ended up suffering the same fate, Mexico. And instead of freaking out, Mexico ended up handling things pretty well. No moral lectures, no economical panic, no boycott of the sort, just patient efforts and smart negotiation. This is how Mexico kept it cool, and Canada did not. It began when Trump announced tariff on Canada and on the entire world. Eventually, some countries decided to retaliate. Europe is a good example of this. Europe ended up imposing over $28 billion of counter tariff on US product. And keep in mind, this is for all 27 countries of the European Union. But fear not, because Canada decided that it could do better than Europe, and we blasted the US with a whopping $30 billion of counter tariff. A dollar for a dollar, said Trudeau. Remember this? And then the federal campaign finally arrived, and it gave us Mark Carney as our brand new prime minister. But there were some harsh things that were said during this campaign. However, between what was said and what was done, our new prime minister is kind of hard to follow sometimes. This video of mine is explaining this a little bit better. So, for a bunch of Canadian politicians who seems convinced that the relationship and the friendship is over, they sure look happy to shake Trump's hand every single chance they have to meet him. And so discussions are going strong between Canada and our new most important enemy, the States, despite all this drama. And drama there is because in mid July, Trump is now aiming at threatening Canada with even more tariff and is now giving us a deadline of August the 1st to solve all of our problems with the US. And again, Canada swears to fight this to the bitter end. This people is a threat. This people may be even a war. Canada's ally is no more. When Trump hit Mexico with tariff last March, the country was taken aback by this. President Claudia Sheinbaum expressed concern but said that Mexico would wait until the beginning of April, April 2nd, when those tariffs would become a reality, before making hasty decision and try to retaliate. The idea of retaliation for Mexico was to impose tariff on Mexican steel and aluminum. Mexico's president was mad, don't get me wrong. She ended up calling those tariffs unjust, unsustainable, and without legal ground. President Sheinbaum also created a tiger team led by her Minister of Economy to immediately start working to try to reverse those tariffs. But before pushing back, she mentioned that if negotiations are failing, then Mexico would retaliate. The White House said last March that the cooperation between the US and Mexico was excellent. Against this statement, Mexico was baffled, but not really shaken. Hence why the little country called these tariffs unjustified. So Mexico ended up pledging to double down their efforts to secure the border, attack drug traffickers, and so on. And finally, Trump ended up removing temporarily his tariffs against Mexico. And this Mexican woman ended up being praised around the world for her efforts. Her message to her people, and I quote, dialogue and respect had prevailed in achieving a pause on US tariff. and that the sovereignty of Mexico would always come first. End quote. Elbows up, anyone? As the drama keep going here in Canada, many Canadians have decided to join their politicians and national medias in the fight against America. A national boycott movement was born as Canadians are now trying to do everything they can to not buy anything made in America. And some data are finally coming out on this since April of 2025. On resume, certain product aimed by retaliatory tariffs have gone down in sale here in Canada quite significantly. And a good example of this is US-based alcohol product. Now, I am showing you a graphic in this study, and this is portraying US wine that ended up going down a lot here in Canada. However, for the Americans watching, wine is a government driven product here, mostly in Canada, because it is the responsibility of the provincial government to sell alcohol. And so when the provinces ended up removing the US product from their shelves, basically, even if you wanted to buy them, it was no longer available. So now I want you to think about it as the government or the provincial government of Canada is buying all of these bottles of wine, paying to get them shipped all across the US to the Canadian US border, pay any custom fees if applicable, then have those bottles transported to their huge distribution centers where hundreds of people are working, then have them shipped again into smaller trucks to all of their stores scattered all across their territories to finally pay employees who are going to put those bottles in those shelves. In the end, only to remove every single one of them and not make a single penny of profit on it to try and absorb all of the expenses I just described to you. That's Canada right there for you, but I digress. The broader, larger effect is harder to evaluate according to this study, but it is confirming that all of our efforts so far in trying to hurt the US basically ended up making a simple dent in their economy. You can imagine that with a huge $41 trillion annual economy, the US is barely feeling the economical pain that we Canadians are trying to inflict on them. Oh, in reality, we are hurting the US economically, roughly around an astounding 0.1% in economical loss per month. The latest Canadian war trend with America is that the US is no longer considered a safe country to visit. Many Canadians love to believe themselves that they are no longer welcome to Uncle Sam's territory. Here is a survey, and the worst province in this is British Columbia, where a 57% of all of them ended up declaring that they felt uneasy and unsafe going down south. The older you get, the more afraid you're supposed to be. Here are some very interesting statistics. If you are 55 years and above, 60% of them are saying that they are afraid. If you are 35 to 54, this is 52% of all of Canadians that are afraid. And if you are between the bracket of 18 to 34, it goes down a little bit to 48%. 1,600 Canadians ended up answering this survey. Not only that, but now snowbirds who are going to spend summertime in the US are also changing their habits. They are now selling their Florida's condos. A weakened Canadian pesos, no pun intended, Mexicans, could explain this phenomenon. Keep in mind that the real estate market right now in Florida is absolutely skyrocketing, as well as insurance costs are also going up. So the financial pressure is really there. But it doesn't matter because some Canadians don't like the tariff on Canadian product that Donald Trump ended up imposing. And so now they feel afraid and unsafe as they stay in the US as individual, and they are also afraid for the sake of their country. Concerning Mexico on this particular topic, well, there's nothing to report. I ended up asking GPT to try and find any kind of warning, fear based messages, boycott from the Mexicans, and nothing came out. Quite the opposite, actually. It is Mexico that is warning outsiders, tourists, to avoid certain sectors of their country. Now, given the message to the US citizen is coming from the US Embassy in Mexico, local authorities are sharing the information, and nothing from the Mexicans are showing any kind of animosity towards the US at the present. If there is one country I think that understands the immense power that the US has, it's Mexico. But you see, this little country ended up being engaged in a serious war nearly 200 years ago that saw a huge portion of its territory being taken away by force. Basically, the US ended up annexing Texas in 1845, and Mexico never accepted and recognized this. The US at the time had an expansionist vision, and Oregon and California was also in their plan. Both were Mexican territories at the time. Of course, a war ended up erupting, and the US finally invaded Mexico City in 1847, and a couple of months later in 1848, peace treaty was signed between the two countries. Mexico had no choice but to recognize the cession of present day Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, as well as parts of present day Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. All this to say, Mexico lost a lot in this war. Still, this conflict is haunting them to this very day, I'm sure, as they ended up watching the USA becoming the greatest power on the planet. All of this might explain why Mexico's attitude is so different than Canada's when they are dealing with the US. All right, before we wrap things up, why don't we play a quick little game? Let's pretend that Canada is a child raised under the protection of the UK and then the US. This little child never had to fight for its survival. It grew up and ended up being invited in one of the nicest houses that the planet has to offer, the G7. Never had to truly earn power. Canada was given power, although it ended up using it quite cleverly up to this point. So when Canada's boat is rocking a little bit, this little country doesn't like it and kind of complains about it and feel personally attacked. Canada might be the polite child sitting at the dinner table who expect dessert for good behavior and then start panicking when it's told that there is none to be given. But what about Mexico? Mexico is a child that was born under invasion, revolution, and constantly feeling the immense powerhouse that is the USA since the very beginning, known for its interference and expansion ideas. Mexico never set foot in the G7 house and will probably have to fight every goddamn inch of it to get access to it. Mexico was also never given power. It had to fight through harsh negotiations, long term solution, and also how to learn to absorb blow and try to repossession every single time. Mexico might be a servant child who is watching the adult fighting, then clean up their mess and try to figure out how to move up quietly the scale of power. Now, there is nothing mean in what I'm trying to do. This is just a little mental exercise that I ended up doing. But I am also very interested in looking at the sheer differences between Canada and Mexico when the two countries are facing the exact same set of challenges and their reaction to said challenges is so different. Thanks for watching.